Welcome to the Fantasy NASCAR podcast. One of the biggest complaints, always in the comments, is my use of the word hog versus dominator, and then the subsequent explanation of why I use hog versus dominator really makes people angry. So I want to go into this point. I should have made this a long time ago. I should have made this terrible looking PowerPoint slide years ago and put it into this. And you know, if you've listened to this podcast, that I am very outspoken in that I think framing is important in any issue, but I also believe that language is extremely important. And if you don't think that language matters and word choice and the way that you choose to guide a conversation or direct someone, well, I'm not going to get into that. If you don't know that, then I don't even know where to begin. So hog versus dominator. And really it's a framing issue in how you go about making your picks. And when you hear someone speaking about fantasy NASCAR and using the word dominator, they are framing the event. They are framing what you're going to predict. They are telling you, you're tuning into their podcast or their video because you want to get some insight. You would like to get some information. And so you're trying to navigate your way through spreadsheets and articles and what you watched in practice. And they're using a language that's directing you in one way, and that is fine, and that is okay, and there is absolutely nothing wrong or negative about using the word dominator. Now, there are trade-offs, there are consequences, there are things that you give up when you choose to use that language, as opposed to my language, which is to use the word hog, which is really, I'm the only person that uses that. So why do I say hog as opposed to dominator? My belief, this is my belief, and you can disagree, and you can disagree in the comments, and I have no problem whatsoever. And you can turn this video off. But my stance is that when you use dominator, you lead yourself and the people watching your videos down a certain path. Whereas when you talk about events and you lay out the context of practice and fantasy NASCAR and use the term hog, you don't necessarily guide players down a direct, singular path. When you use the word hog, subconsciously, I am framing it to leave doors open, to leave paths open, to help the people listening and viewing and studying and researching and making picks find their own way. Now, here's how I'll explain this. When I use the word hog to determine, and we're talking about the drivers that lead the most laps and score the most fast laps, I call those drivers hogs. Other people refer to them as dominators. They dominated the race. I don't believe that domination necessarily, it can happen. There have been events in racing where domination absolutely occurs, but it's few and far between. It is very rare. And to use it on a weekly basis for every single race that weekend, it's crazy. There's a dominator in a truck race, an Xfinity race, and a cup race every single weekend. I don't know. I've been watching these races. I haven't seen it. When have you seen it where as much as people use the word dominator, you would assume as much as people use the word dominator in their videos or just in the parlance of talking to each other about fantasy NASCAR and in Slack chats, as much as that word gets used, you would assume that every single one of these events during every weekend is controlled by one individual driver, and you know that is just not the case. We rarely get a weekend where any of the three races are dominated by a specific driver. It doesn't happen that often. But by using this word over and over and over, you've created a frame, a mindset, an idea that people control these races, that people are in complete control of these races, that a driver and their car and their team are always in control or can be in control. Just stop and say, beyond the fact that they are always in control, beyond the idea that they are in control, the idea that they can be in control. Stop, think. The idea that they can be in control. When you know there are part failures, when you know track position matters, when you know that you don't always have the greatest racing package, when you know that the tracks change from week to week and people get on hot streaks and people find speed and lose speed, and yet you're going to sit there and think that someone can control a race. Yeah, it can happen. But does it happen enough that you're going to describe every race or predict every race or debate every race with that word dominator? I don't think it suits the situation. And it's not just being nitpicking. When you start following that path and using that word, you are guided down a certain route. Let's just look. So when I use hog, I use it because it treats fast laps and laps led as arbitrary statistics, because they are. And all you have to do is stop and think. Before 2015, before DraftKings launched a fantasy NASCAR podcast or product, did you ever, in all of your racing years, think that fast laps were an important statistic? Did you ever say, boy, he ran a fast lap on lap 201. He must be what? Sounds like a pretty arbitrary statistic to me. That doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily go to the best driver, but it is a made-up stat. Laps led. Leading X amount of laps. Someone might say, well, that's an important thing. Well, leading the most laps, I'll give you credit for that. That is a significant thing. If we say, all right, this driver led the most laps in the race, although I'm not going to give it that much because all really matters is leading the last lap, but leading 50 laps versus leading 30 laps, and this guy led 80 laps, it tends to lean more towards arbitrary. And that's just from the statistical fan perspective. When we look at how these stats are actually accrued, and if you've been playing for the last decade and watching who's earning fast laps, who's leading laps, and as we have changed packages, sure, sometimes in the past, during certain situations, the laps led and the fast laps have absolutely synced up with this is the best driver right now. This is the best driver on this day, or this is the best car on this day, or this is the best car over the last month. Absolutely. There have been plenty of times where they have synced up, but there also have been plenty of times where fast laps, and I'm not talking about the random places where a guy puts on tires and gets off sequences getting fast laps, but I'm talking about regular occasions where, based on track position and a move here or there, a guy that wasn't supposed to lead laps, wasn't the best in practice, didn't have the best car lately, but he had decent track position and he got the lead and just hung on because it's hard to pass in NASCAR. And it didn't matter what data point you looked at beforehand. Same thing with laps led. Not saying it's completely arbitrary, but if we're on a spectrum of arbitrary versus the dominator mindset, which says that these things are certain, it's a certainty. This guy was fast in practice. This guy's been running really well the last 3 weeks. This guy is great at this racetrack. He's one of the best drivers. His crew chief always nails the setup here. Dominator leans more towards fast laps and lap sleds are going to be connected to some data points. And they can be. But when you go that route, you really are locked into, all right, I got to find some stats that back up making this play. You're going into the race, you're making your picks, you're looking for your dominator. And so you're looking at practice data, you're looking at previous races, you're looking at track history, and you're trying to find certainty. You're going with the data-driven, which is fine, but you can't only go that route. The hog accepts that, yeah, there's some data that we can find, but the hog framing says, yes, but there's also some arbitrary nature to NASCAR naturally, especially in the next-gen package, or especially when we have an Xfinity series that's as weak probably, or inexperienced, and as rambunctious as ever. There's no data-driven point for we have some rambunctious spoiled brats in the Xfinity series. I mean, there is. You just look at who wins, and you look at the fights, and you look at the wrecks, and you look at the names, and you look at who their daddies were. But the hog says, okay, there's some data, but there's also arbitrary. Whereas the dominator says, nope, data, data, data. It closes a door. It leads you down a certain path. Correlative versus causal. Again, dominator thinks that once this guy leads a bunch of laps and runs a bunch of fast laps, there was some sort of cause. He was fast in practice. He did something that links with it that then allows you to make that dominator pick. You're always looking for a cause and effect type of relationship, whereas, guys that kind of run up front have a good chance of leading laps, running fast laps. It doesn't really, I'm not necessarily looking for a specific this, leads to A leads to B. Whereas a dominator, it's certain, it's data driven. A happens, that means B happens. That's how I'm going to make my picks. Whereas the hog is, yeah, but there are some arbitrary situations that happen in a race that knock people out, that boost people up, they catch a lucky break at the right time, and they end up in the right position. There's a lot of different variables that will happen. Also, it's correlative in that, yeah, A sometimes happens and then B happens, but it doesn't always happen that way. A doesn't always cause B. But when we get a lot of A, maybe we get some B. It's more open-minded. It doesn't mean the hog also, again, accepts because it accepts the arbitrary nature and accepts that there's correlation, which doesn't mean it's always going to be a cause and effect situation. It might happen. It happens at a little higher rate. That there's a little volatility, whereas the dominator subconsciously thinks that, oh, he's a dominator, or I'm looking for a dominator. And so you get your A equals B, you get your data point, you go down the route of all this is very, very predictable. The hog's not saying it's not predictable. It's saying, yeah, there's some predictability involved in it, but there's also some volatility. And you got to open the door for that. Whereas when you're looking for a dominator, I mean, when I say that word, dominator, you get an idea of a specific driver or a specific type of driver. And that means you're already well on down the road. Whereas when I say hog, you're like, well, anybody can do that. Absolutely. That is the point. That is what I'm trying to drive home. When I use my language, you're going to have more options. You're going to go in different directions when you try to pick that guy who's going to lead a bunch of laps or run a bunch of fast laps or get in the top 5 in scoring in those terms. Because you don't have an idea what a hog is. A hog is a guy that he could be great, but he could also score a bunch of meaningless points just because he gets a lot of work. Kobe Bryant, great player, but at the end of his career, he was the ball hog. He wasn't good. The Lakers were terrible, but his usage rate was through the roof. He took shots non-stop. He was a hog. And guess what? In DFS, there were nights where he absolutely exploded. There are nights where he imploded. Was he good? Sometimes. Sometimes he didn't have to be good because he just got so many shots. He was a hog. So a hog is kind of this vague thing that we don't even really know what it is. It can be a bunch of points. It doesn't have to be rooted in data. And that's why it's more of a GPP strategy for GPP players to talk and think in this language. If you're thinking in Dominator, there are about 3 or 4 guys that you're thinking about. Now, maybe you've got more guys, but I bet you've already created a hierarchy in your mind. You have tiers of dominators, and you're going to favor one group over the other. Again, subconsciously. Whether you're not going to play Chase Briscoe. You're not. Now, he might be on your hierarchy somewhere, but when push comes to shove and you're really building lineups, because you have this dominator verbiage, and that's your lexicon, that you are subconsciously breaking these guys into different groups. Whereas in the hog pool of hogs, Larson versus Briscoe, when you go in saying, yeah, some arbitrary things can happen, you're going to play more Briscoe than you would if you're looking for a dominator. Just think of that. If I speak of these guys in terms of hogs and who guys can lead laps and can run fast laps and can get some of these arbitrary stats versus a dominator who's going to dominate, Larson, Briscoe, more than likely, the ownership of Briscoe in the dominator category probably going to be lower. Among the players who like to use the word hog, probably going to play more Briscoe. Now, that could backfire. That might not work out. In the long run, playing enough lineups in a season-long mode, it may not be the best strategy. But if we're looking at who could probably ping or ding a GPP and win first, I would rather go with the GPP strategy over and over and over. Last thing to say, when we say hog, again, buying into the, hey, there's correlation, but there's also tons of arbitrary situations in these races. There's a lot of volatility. And a lot of that has to do with a bad racing package. So maybe you don't necessarily want to do this in the Xfinity series where the racing package is a little bit more predictable, where there's a clear difference. But in the Cup series, for certain, the racing package is bad. And that increases the volatility. That increases who gets these arbitrary stats and the events that happen that randomly shuffle people here and there. All of that lends itself to a bad racing package, which is the reality. We're not in disagreement there. Maybe you could say that the intermediate track's a little bit different, but most will agree that overall, NASCAR's had some pretty bad racing packages in the Cup Series. Now, when you're using Dominator, whether you know it or not, whether you admit it or not, you are pretending that this is a real racing package because you believe there's certainty. You believe that your pick is going to be causal, like A happens, B happens, that it's going to be data-driven. Now, the only way that you can have certainty, data-driven, and causal relationships is if there's a real racing package. And what I mean by that is that the fastest car wins. The fastest car gets to the front. The best driver gets to the front. And that random events don't occur. Random parts don't break. Tires don't blow out. You're able to pass an inferior car. You're not completely hampered by dirty air. I would say that 2018, 2017, you had a real racing package. You had horsepower. You had low downforce. And that favored the better teams, the better cars, and the better drivers. And so using Dominator in 2017, using the word Dominator in 2018, probably not the worst idea because you had a real racing package. You had predictability. There were causal relationships. You had solid practice data. You had current form. All of those things definitely linked up. And you did see a lot of chalk lead laps. You did see a lot of chalk run fast laps. But in a bad racing package, don't really have that. At the very least, which I think this is very conservative, you have it a lot less. There it is. There's the reason why I use Hog. If you want to use Dominator, that's fine. But you need to make sure you're using a caveat and or doing whatever you can to make sure that you break free from certain thoughts so that you build better lineups, whatever, and whatnot.